A conversation on U.S. military readiness and the global threats we face. Our guest is Dakota Wood, the Heritage Foundation's Defense Program Senior Research Fellow, served 2 decades in the Marine Corps. And Mr. Wood, assessing U.S. military strength, a pretty major undertaking. How does the Heritage Foundation try to do that?
Well, what we gather all publicly available information that we can come across. So official testimony from the Pentagon, acquisition reports on major programs, general news reporting from the defense reporting community, our own personal contacts in the services and the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill. And we gather all that all year long, go through a several-month analysis and writing process, compare last year's information to this year's information, and then basically issue a report card on the military. And this year, on a scale of 1 to 5, we would give it a 3, or in the words we use, we call it marginal. And we feel that the U.S. military writ large is marginally able to meet the demands of U.S. national security requirements, meaning they could handle one major conflict in one part of the world, but not much more than that. And we think it needs to be more than that because the U.S. has global interests and global responsibilities.
The U.S. military budget has increased under the Trump administration. Has that made an impact?
It actually has, and we've seen that mostly in readiness. Things like building new ships and airplanes, these are multi-year efforts, and it takes a while to expand or grow the size of the military. The same thing on manpower in strength, the number of people that you have in there as well. But readiness, where you get people that you have with the equipment they have into the field to train and fly and shoot and drive and all those sorts of things to be competent in what they're doing, that has really improved over the last 2 or 3 years. So if we were going to put one high point in this year's report card, it's increased readiness of the force that we currently have.
It's the 2021 Index of U.S. Military Strength. You can find it at heritage.org. That's what we're going to be talking about in this 45-minute segment of the Washington Journal. Phone line split up this way if you want to join this conversation this morning with Dakota Wood of the Heritage Foundation. Democrats can call in at 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, Independents 202-748-8002. Active and retired members of the military. A special line for you. Do want to hear from you this morning. 202-748-8003 is that number. The report, want to dive into it, Mr. Wood. One of the key topics, assessing the global operating environment. That's the threats we're facing in the world. Where are they coming from?
Well, it's actually two parts you're talking about. The world as an operating environment. Is it easier or difficult for the American military to do what we would call it upon to do? So in that section, we look at our friends and allies and where we have forces at, and do they know how to work in a particular area? The threat section is really to your point, and we look at Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and then kind of the general destabilizing influence of terrorism in key parts of the world. And we assess that the threat environment in general is high, not the highest category, being a 4 on our score of 1 to 5, but in that high category, because the main competitors like China and Russia have really made serious investments in their military capabilities, expanding their reach, more of a power projection force, really improved the capability of their forces with longer range, guided munitions, a lot more attention to training for readiness and combat competencies. Iran has expanded its portfolio of missiles to 3,000 ballistic missiles. And certainly you've seen the news headlines with China and what they've been doing in the South China Sea. So it's a worrisome environment from a threats perspective. From the ally and partner perspective, they have been making some progress, especially in the last year or two, and among NATO members, making more investments in their own defense, but they're still falling far short of where they need to be.
Really would encourage viewers to go to heritage.org, open up this very easy to navigate index because you can follow along with some of the easy to read charts that we're going to be going through for our visual learners. We're showing them the capability of the threats around the world. You talked about Russia and China as being rated as formidable threats. On the lower end of at least the threat scale are those that you consider to be capable threats. Middle East terrorism falls into that, as well as Afghanistan, Pakistan terrorism. Explain why that's on the lower level of capability.
Right. So in those tables, we tried to use descriptive words. I mean, what does a 2 or a 4 mean? So using our language to convey a sense of, is it something you really need to be concerned about, or is this something, that generates a sense of urgency? And so when we look at threat, it's a combination of intent and capability. And you can't really measure intent, so we look at observed behavior. How has a country been behaving? And as it's been behaving more or less aggressively, what are the tools that it has? So when you look at terror groups, they don't possess submarines and combat aircraft fleets and large land forces with ballistic missiles and those sorts of things, right? But they do pose an on-the-ground immediate threat, especially in a politically destabilizing way. So you can have a terror group like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State or Al-Shabaab that is very aggressive in its rhetoric, but their capability is limited to small arms, manufactured bombs, maybe some smaller gauge rockets. So we give them a lower score on the capability side, even if their activities have been very aggressive.
And here's the part of that report that those who are calling in on the active and retired military lines will probably be perhaps most interested or maybe most respond to. It's talking about the capabilities, the readiness and the capacity of the military branches in this country. And just taking a look at the comparison between the Army and the Navy, the Army rated very high when it comes to readiness, weak when it comes to its capacity. You can see the comparison to the Navy here. Weak when it comes to capacity, readiness more on the marginal level. Explain the differences to that and why you chose those rankings.
Well, on the capacity, it's very important to understand our scoring, that we think that the U.S. military needs to be able to handle two major problems. So if you got tied up in the Asia-Pacific region, some kind of a problem or a conflict with China, it's not that you can leave the Middle East or Europe when you've got Iran and Russia. So you have to have a sufficiently large capability that you can address U.S. interests in multiple regions. And that's why we think this two-war capacity force is so critical. So when we look at the U.S. Navy and we look at the Army, they just don't have the numbers of units. It doesn't mean that the individuals, sailors and soldiers, are weak or any of that. Extraordinarily competent people. We just don't have enough of them. The Army has paid a lot of attention to the readiness of its forces, sending its brigade combat teams to its national training centers, really making the shift from counterterrorism sorts of focus operations to readying itself if it had to go into large-scale conventional conflict against a major opponent like a Russia or a China, right? Something like that. So their readiness is almost off the charts. I mean, that they've spent a lot of time getting their units back up to speed, whereas the Navy has had some really problematic maintenance areas, keeping ships out at sea, doing a quick turn through its shipyards with all the backlog maintenance that had occurred over many years. And so when you look at those scores, the force we have today, not the one 5 years from now, if it was called upon to go to war, the forces are too small for the tasks that we think that they would have, and they really need to do a lot more focus on modernizing their equipment, which is a lot of money from Congress that's needed, and then spending time and attention to make sure those forces are competent and proficient. So that's kind of explains some of the scoring methodology we used in those charts.
If you